Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy little human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's Morbid makeup video. I'm so happy we can meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this craziness today, you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or BRATTERSTEIN, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the Clutter family murders. Are you familiar? I bet you are, since you're into true crime. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new Morbid makeup video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. And you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter if you want. They're both BRATTERSTEIN, but no pressure. All right, now that I'm done essentially begging you to be my friend, let's go ahead and get into this story. On November 14th, 1959, two men got in their car and made the over 400-mile drive to the home that belonged to the Clutter family, anticipating robbing this family and anticipating having a really big payout. To say what happened in that farmhouse that day was a robbery gone wrong would be a grave understatement, because it doesn't quite capture the callousness of this crime, because though robbery was the main motivation in this crime, both men who committed the crime shared a similar mantra: leave no living witnesses. Now, this crime ended up being one of the largest, most popular, and most talked about multiple murders in Kansas history, in part because of a couple factors. One, who the murder victims were, where the murder took place, the time that the murder took place. But another big contributing factor to the fame of this crime is that this crime was the subject matter that was depicted in the book In Cold Blood, written by Truman Capote, which is highly recognized as the very first true crime novel ever written in a non-fiction style. I wasn't even planning on doing a video on this case initially. I was actually just reading In Cold Blood for pleasure, as one does. And once I started reading it, I found that I fell down a rabbit hole, okay? I started with the book, and then it was all the articles, and then it was documentaries, and I just have so much information in my head. I did so much work learning everything about this case that I figured I must bring it to you because I already did the work looking into it, so you don't have to. I can bring it all to you in one concise story. So with that said, I'm now going to tell you that story. While I tell you the story, I'm going to put on a full face of makeup. If that's not your thing, that's fine. Thanks for hanging out this long. I hope you find somebody who's more your speed. But if you're kind of like on the fence, like, sounds weird, I don't know how I feel, maybe hang around. You may be surprised by how much you like me. I don't know. I'm a good time. What can I say? With that said, come gather around and let me tell you about the Clutter family murders. On the morning of November 15th, 1959, a Sunday, a teenage girl named Nancy, this girl was a friend of Nancy Clutter, the 16-year-old girl who lived on the household, so they're both named Nancy. Well, this friend Nancy showed up at the Clutter's property like she did every Sunday morning so that she could ride with her friend Nancy and her friend Nancy's family to church. She would always show up and they would carpool together to church each Sunday. This poor girl, man, I can't even imagine being a teenager and finding what she did. So she gets there, she knocks on the door. Her father's waiting in the car for her because he always waited for her to get inside before he would drive away. I guess he was not a church-going man. And when she knocked on the door, nobody answered. So her dad's sitting in the car watching her and she's like, oh, that's weird. So she looks over into the garage and she sees that the cars are still there, so they clearly have not left. So she walks along to the side of the house where there is another door and she sees that it is slightly open. So she kind of calls in, Nancy, Nancy, Mr. Clutter, Mrs. Clutter, and receives no answer. So immediately this girl Nancy feels a little bit uneasy. This is very unlike the Clutters. They're normally up, moving, they have a lot going on by this time in the morning. So she goes back to the car and her dad's like, okay, let's go and drive over to your other friend's house and see what's up. So they drive over to the house of another friend of Nancy Clutter's, a girl named Susan. And they use her phone and the girls call the Clutter home. Maybe they didn't want to just go inside. So they're like, okay, we'll call. So they did. They called and nobody answered. So they're like, that's odd. Maybe everyone's overslept and they're not hearing the phone. So then friend Nancy and friend Susan get in Nancy's dad's car and they go back to the property. And for some reason, this father sends both girls back in the house instead of going in himself. I'm assuming he didn't really think there was anything too serious going on maybe they had just overslept. So the girls go over to the open door and they start calling out to the family again. So now that there was 2 girls, they were feeling a little bit braver and they're like, you know what, let's just go inside. Let's go inside and let's try to see what's going on. So they enter the open door, and as they're going up the stairs to Nancy's room, they glance over and they see Nancy's purse is laying on the floor and it's open. So the bravery that they felt in being a pair and entering the house probably dissipated a little bit. So they then climb the stairs and they get to Nancy's room, and that's when they find 16-year-old Nancy Clutter dead in her bed. This is when the teenage girls freak out, as one would, and run out of the house. They tell Nancy's father what happened, and this is when her father, his name was Clarence, by the way, he goes into the house and he's like, okay, I gotta call the cops, I gotta get them here right away. Call the cops, call an ambulance. And this is when he found that the phone line in the Clutter home had been cut, and he's like, oh man, this is even, like, that's not good. So they then book it away from there, find a phone, call the police, and they're like, hey, you need to get to the Clutter house immediately. When police arrived at the property, they found that every single member of the Clutter family who still lived in the home at the time had been shot to death. This was 48-year-old Herbert Clutter, 45-year-old Bonnie Clutter, 16-year-old Nancy Clutter, and her younger brother, 15-year-old Kenyon Clutter. They were all dead. So now I want to talk about the Clutters a little bit and who they were as people. Then we'll talk about the dicks who killed them and the crime itself. Herb Clutter, a Gemini, was known overall to everyone who knew him as just being a really nice man. He was the type of man who would make you feel comfortable immediately upon him entering a room. He was a strong man both in his character and in his stature, and he was the type of person who made you feel safe just being in his presence. His presence was also well known around the town, and not just for those who knew him personally in life. He was a well-known farmer owning the over 640,000 acre River Valley farm and was a prominent member of the church that he and his family attended. Bonnie Clutter was a Capricorn, and she was the type of woman who kept her house nice, decorated, clean, ready for company. The family hosted often, and Bonnie was a perfect natural entertainer. Bonnie loved being outdoors, and she was a particularly religious woman, and she loved to sit outside with her children and just be in tune with God and with nature. She would often take her kids outside and just have them sit there, sit on the grass, listen to the sounds, look at everything around them, and just appreciate the world that they existed in and the life that they had. Bonnie had had a little bit of mental health trouble after she started having her children. She probably, I would imagine, now would have been just diagnosed with postpartum depression, but she did everything she could to try to help her situation. She went to therapy. She was really trying to get better, and she was overall just known as being a wonderful, happy, and just great woman. Nancy Clutter was a very typical, pretty, sweet 16-year-old girl, and like her mother, she was also a Capricorn. Nancy was just like a good girl. She loved writing letters to her friends and her family members. She was well behaved. She did well in school. And she was the type of kid that would go to church without having to be forced into going. She was just very easy, you know what I mean? Like she wasn't like a problem child is what I'm trying to say. She was just like a normal 16-year-old girl, you know. She liked boys. She even had a steady boyfriend named Bobby. And poor Bobby was actually at the house with the family the night that they died before they were killed, obviously. Initially, Bobby and Nancy had even had plans to go to the movies the Saturday night that she was killed, but for whatever reason, they decided to go Friday instead, and he often still to this day thinks like what would have happened if we had just waited and gone on Saturday. Kenyon Clutter was 15 years old, and he was just like a tall, lengthy 15-year-old Virgo. He was just like a silly little boy. Kenyon was the type of kid who didn't talk about doing things. He would actually be about doing things, whether that would be like going out hunting with friends of his or friends of his father's, or going out and buying like an old beat up truck just so that he could have it and ride it until the wheels fell off. The Clutters were just good people, and their loss was not only felt within their friends, their family, the people who loved them, but the community of Holcomb, Kansas, where they were from in general. In the words of one of the surviving members of the Clutter family, they weren't just murdered, they were wonderful people. Sadly though, you know, they were murdered, and it's so messed up, dude. I don't understand what's up with people, like why they do the things they do. Like some people are just such dicks, man. And speaking of dicks, let's get into discussing the 2 men who murdered this entire family. Perry Edward Smith was born October 27th, 1928, making him a Scorpio. And as a Scorpio, I will just say right now, I do not claim him. Perry had an interesting life, to say the least. He was born in Huntington, Nevada, to parents Florence Julia Buckskin and John Smith, both who were rodeo performers and who went by the stage names of Flo and Tex, and he was one of 4 children. Perry's family was pretty dysfunctional. Both his parents had a bit of an alcohol problem. His mom also had a bit of an adultery problem, and when his father would drink the homemade whiskey that he made and sold as another profession, a side job, as opposed to just being a rodeo performer, he would physically and emotionally abuse his wife and his children. In 1935, Perry's mother left his father, and she was the one who ended up taking the children, and she moved from where the family lived in Alaska to San Francisco, California, but leaving the marriage didn't seem to be much better for her, and being out of that situation didn't seem much better for the kids because, you know, his mother had developed a bit of an alcohol problem, as I said, and she ended up dying by choking to death on her own vomit when Perry was only 13 years old. After his mother's death, with his father out of the picture and no real family in sight, Perry and his siblings were all sent to live in an orphanage, and according to Perry, at this orphanage, the abuse did not cease. So this was a Catholic orphanage, so it was run by nuns, and apparently the nuns were incredibly abusive physically to Perry all the time. They often beat him, and most of this came because he was unable to stop wetting the bed even in his teenage years. Once Perry was actually old enough to leave the orphanages on his own, he ended up linking back up with his father in Alaska, and the two kind of lived together as drifters, but eventually Perry ended up leaving his father, and he got into a little legal trouble circling in and out of youth detention centers. It seems that the childhood that Perry and his siblings endured, along with the lifestyle that his parents lived, was just no good for anyone in the Smith family, though Perry was the only one who went on to do something, or was known to go on to do something quite as horrible as he did. 5 of the 6 members of the Smith family all had a terrible end. Perry committing the Clutter murders, his mother Flo drinking herself to death, his sister Joy committing suicide, his brother James committing suicide, and his father later in life, John, committed suicide. So there's definitely something in the water there. Like that's a lot. It's a lot. The only member of Perry's family that seemed to escape this fate was his sister Barbara, and Barbara had cut all communication off with Perry, even moved and not told him where she was going long before he was even arrested. Next, let's talk about the other killer, Richard Eugene Hickok. Richard Hickok was born June 6, 1931, making him a Gemini. Richard was born to parents Walter and Eunice Hickok, and Richard, who went by Dick in his life because choices, by all accounts had a good childhood. He had a strict household, but they were loving in his own way. Dick did well in school. He was very popular. He was an athlete. The ladies loved him. Like, you know the type. And after after high school, he had plans to go to college, but his family couldn't afford it. So he stayed in town and he worked as a mechanic. So there's nothing in Dick's early years, his childhood, that you would point out and go oh, that's where it went wrong. Like with Perry Smith, you're oh, this kid had no chance. Of course he ended up bad. But in Dick's background, there's nothing in his childhood that really points to the defining moment. But there is a defining moment in his adult life that you can look at and be oh, that's probably a little bit off, because it's something that's a common theme with a lot of murderers. And just for clarity, I don't tell you the backstories to these killers to excuse what they've done. I don't feel like I really need to say that, but there's always somebody who thinks, whatever. It's to explain how maybe they got here. There's no excuse for what they did. What they did is horrible. They're horrible, evil people. But this is just to explain a little bit. Not excuse, just explain. So when Dick was 19 years old, he was in a pretty serious car accident. He ended up being thrown from the vehicle, and he almost died. And luckily or unluckily, depending on how you look at it, he did end up surviving, but he was left pretty disfigured. If you look at photos of him, he has a little bit of a asymmetrical face with a droop to one side. He also claimed to have lingering headaches, dizzy spells, blackouts, and hemorrhages from his nose and also his ear based on the serious head injury that he had during the accident. And those who knew him said that after Dick had gone through that accident, he was never himself again. His personality totally changed, and he was just different, which is a common theme we see with head injuries. He had just fundamentally changed. And once he was released from the hospital, he found that he had a mountain of debt. This is, you know, medical bills in the United States. Listen, bro. So Dick, finding himself in debt, started turning to less, you know, ideal means of making money and supplementing that income, and he got into gambling and writing bad checks. Incidentally, the writing of bad checks is what ended up helping them catch Dick and Perry later on in this story, but yeah, he got into writing bad checks, and when he was 26, he ended up getting arrested because he broke into somebody's house and stole a gun. Richard had been married at one point. I think he was actually married twice. The first time he got married was right around the time that he got his head injury, and he married a 16-year-old girl. I know times were different and like older men married younger women, but it's still just like, ugh, gross. Anyway, he ended up actually cheating on her. He had an affair, and he ended up getting his side chick pregnant. Then ended up leaving his first wife, and he married his side chick, and they went on to have a couple of kids. Yeah, this guy was a father even. But the second wife ended up divorcing him as well when he was in prison. Not for the murders. He got arrested for something else, and she divorced him while he was in prison. Which honestly was like good for her, because it comes out later, and I'm sure she was horrified to hear that Dick was kind of a piece of shit, and he had a thing for underage girls, like kids and teenagers and all of that. Like, he was a bit of a piece of human garbage. And he even admitted later that part of the draw of going to the Clutter home was that he knew that there was a 16-year-old girl who lived there, and he was pretty intent on raping her. So, fuck him. It was while in prison where Dick Hitchcock and Perry Smith's paths eventually crossed. They were in jail at the same time, and when when Perry was released first, the two decided to like stay in touch, exchange information, sign each other's yearbooks. You know, you rock, don't ever change. They decided that they wanted to link up once they were on the other side and stay in touch with each other, which is, as we now know, not good. It was while in prison that Dick met another man, a man who would give him some information that would catapult him and Perry Smith to Holcomb in 1959. This was a man named Floyd Wells, and Floyd Wells was telling that he had once worked for a man who owned a large wheat farm in rural southern Kansas, a man named Mr. Clutter. He had worked on the Clutter property for about a year, and he had developed like a great fondness for not only Mr. Clutter, but for Mr. Clutter's entire family. He really liked him. Mr. Clutter paid him well. He was like a really good boss. So I don't know why he would tell Dick about him, but he did. So while Dick and Floyd Wells were in jail together, they just kind of became buds. They talked to each other like, oh, what brings you here? Oh, what jobs did you used to do before you became a criminal or whilst being a criminal? And this is when Floyd Wells told Dick that he had once worked for a very rich farmer named Mr. Clutter. And Dick, naturally, his ears perked up at the word rich. So he starts asking Floyd a bunch of questions like, oh, rich? How rich? Where does he live exactly? Oh, out in the middle of nowhere where he has no neighbors and he's completely isolated. Oh, okay. Can you draw me an entire layout of the house, please? And while you're at it, could you please put exactly where that safe is that holds that money? Thank you. And Floyd apparently was like, yeah, I'll give you that information. No problem. It's barely an inconvenience. So apparently Dick told Floyd that he had a friend on the outside that he was planning on linking up with as soon as he got out of jail, a man named Perry Smith, and that the two were going to pull off a bunch of jobs, you know, robbing people to get enough money to buy a boat, go out to Mexico, live on this boat, and do deep sea fishing. And that now Dick would very much like to add the Clutter family onto the list of people that they were going to rob, because, I mean, this guy's got hella money hidden in a safe, according to Floyd Wells. And Floyd was like, cool. Sure. But what do you plan to do with that family, though, since there's like an entire family that lives there? And Dick was kind of like, you know, I'll deal with that when I come to it. I'll probably tie them up, rob them, and murder them. Dick went on to tell Floyd that Perry was the perfect guy to enlist in this crime because, as far as he knew, Perry had killed a man before. It's been looked into, and it appears that this couldn't be confirmed that it actually happened. Perry might have just been telling Dick this so that he looked like a hard ass in prison, but either way, he's like, if I'm gonna kill somebody, Perry is my guy. And for whatever reason, Floyd just never told anybody about Dick saying this. He says he didn't think Dick would actually do it, but he was very wrong. After serving just over a year in prison, Dick was released in August of 1959, just a couple of months before the murders. Apparently when Dick got out of prison, he tried to live on the straight and narrow. Straight and narrow? Is it straight and narrow or straight and arrow? He tried to live a good life, get a job, you know, be a respectable member of society, or so he says. I mean, he was released in August and the murders happened in November, so honestly, like, how hard could he have really tried? Shortly thereafter, Dick contacted his friend Perry Smith and he told him all about his plan, about the house, about the safe with the money, and how it was a for sure thing. Initially, Perry wasn't super interested, but he was easily persuaded and he agreed to meet Dick in Olathe, Kansas, and once there, the two would get their things in order, get all their supplies together, put new tires on the car, and then make the 6-hour drive to Holcomb, Kansas. Holcomb, Kansas was a small, unincorporated town where everyone knew everyone. And I know people always say that, like everyone knew everyone. It was a super small town, but this was like a very small town. The main road was a dirt road, like you know the type of town. It was filled with farms and private owned businesses, and people who own these businesses wouldn't even lock their doors at night, you know what I mean? And even if you didn't really know everyone by name, you knew everyone's faces, so there were no strangers in Holcomb. At the time of the murders, Perry was a drifter, so no one was really gonna notice that he was missing while they were, you know, going to commit this crime, but Dick lived with his parents and I believe a brother at the time, so they did need to come up with a story for him. So they told Dick's family, like Perry and him, were going to be going over to Perry's sister's house in Fort Scott, Kansas, because Perry's sister owed Perry some money and they wanted to get some money so that they could get this boat. So they then headed to Fort Scott, which was 6 hours from where they were actually going in Holcomb. So the two men left Dick's family's home in the early morning hours of November 14th, 1959, and they did not return until about noon on November 15th, 1959. And what they did during that time period is absolutely horrible, unimaginable, unforgivable. They annihilated an entire family in cold blood. When the two returned back home and they had no money, spoiler alert, Dick told his family that the trip was fruitless when they had arrived. They found that Perry's sister had actually moved and hadn't told him. So the whole trip had been for nothing. But what really happened is horrible. So buckle in, we're getting into what really happened that night now. The two men entered the Clutter home, which was a nice large farmhouse that was sitting far back away from the road. You have to go down a long driveway to get there. Very isolated, no close neighbors, and they entered the home through an unlocked door. That's how innocent this town was. So I guess a lot of towns were innocent like this, but after what happened here, this town was never this innocent again. Once the two entered the home, they first came upon Herbert Clutter. He and his wife had been sleeping separate. She was upstairs, he was downstairs. They woke him up and they were like, hey, bam, where's the safe? And right away, Herbert was like, what are you talking about? There is no safe. I own no safe. But the men did not believe him initially, particularly Dick, and they persisted. And if these men had done any sort of research, any sort of vetting, I guess how are they really going to look into this? I don't know. But it was very well known around town that the Clutter family had no money in the house. Herb was the type of man who only wrote checks, like that was it. He never had any money in the house, and this was common knowledge. So when they were like, where's the safe? And he was like, I have no safe, I have no money. He meant it. The two men then went from room to room, waking each member of the family and moving them into a bathroom together while they continued searching the home. Dick was convinced that the safe was still there, it was just hidden, but Perry was starting to get a little bit skeptical. He said that he could tell that Mr. Clutter was a good man and that he was being honest. He said that he like showed a bit of fondness when he talked about Mr. Clutter, which is really, really weird. I'm talking about Perry here. Perry. The men then made the decision to separate the family. So they took Bonnie Clutter, Herb's wife, and they put her in her bedroom. And the whole time, this poor woman must have been so scared. She was telling them over and over, like, we have no safe, my husband's not lying, there's no money in this house. And her husband was just like trying to be there for her and trying to be comforting and was like, don't worry, honey, don't freak out, everything is fine, they're just here for money. Nancy was taken to her room and tied and left in her own bed. And side note, okay, ugh, it's so gross. So this is rough, but during this whole hellish night, Dick had the plan from the beginning to rape Nancy. It was something that he was very much looking forward to. He even said, and I quote, and this is a disgusting quote, this is something he said to Perry, "I'd sure like to bust that little girl's box out." I know that that's hard to hear, and I know that that's absolutely disgusting, but I feel like it needs to be said because there was this type of person who later, once they got caught, because they get caught obviously, tried to act like he was such a good guy, how he wasn't that bad, how he never pulled the trigger, but he was clearly a piece of human shit. So Dick said this to Perry, and apparently after saying that, he was like, "Oh, and then when I'm done, you can have a go for it." And Perry was like, "Absolutely fucking not." Apparently Perry had a big problem with men who couldn't control their sexual impulses, and he wasn't into little girls. So thankfully that didn't happen. Anyways, after leaving Nancy tied up in her room, the two men took Herb, and his son Kenyon downstairs to the basement. They put Herb on a mattress box so that he'd be more comfortable and didn't have to lay directly on the ground, which is odd. And they tied Kenyon to a couch in the basement, again putting a pillow under his head so he'd be more comfortable while he laid there. And I believe it was Perry. Yeah, it was Perry who made the choices to make these people more comfortable, which is just odd. Perry's an odd guy in general. The two men then completely ransacked the home. They had realized there is no safe, so let's take everything we can find and steal it, all the money in the home. So they had gone into that home expecting to get around $10,000 out of a safe. That's what Floyd said was typically on the property. They ended up finding less than $50, a little radio, and a pair of binoculars. It was at this point that the men could have chalked it up as a loss. They could have been like, we tried, we failed, there's no money here. They could have just left. But neither man wanted a chance going back to prison. And as I said, they had that mantra of leave no living witnesses. The men then moved through the house and murdered every member of the Clutter family one by one. They started with Herbert, and they first slit his throat and then shot him in the head. They then moved on to his son Kenyon, who was laying on the couch in the basement with him, and they shot him in the head. They then went upstairs and they shot Nancy in the back of the head and ended by entering Bonnie's room and shooting her in the side of the head. They were all shot in the head with a shotgun. Now, who actually did the shooting is unclear. Perry initially said that he killed Herbert and Kenyon. I think this is actually what's in his signed confession, is that he killed Herbert and Kenyon and that Dick killed Nancy and Bonnie, but Dick claims that he never shot anybody and that Perry killed everyone. Apparently later on, Perry even tried to change his confession and to tell the police that he actually did kill everybody. He said that Dick's parents were really good people and he didn't want them to think that their son was a killer when he wasn't. And Dick always claimed that he never ever shot anyone, so who really knows? I don't. But what I do know is that the whole thing was Dick's idea and it never would have happened without him, and that part we know to be true. The family that these men murdered, man, they were so well loved that over 1,000 people came to the Clutter family funeral. After this murder, man, the whole community, everyone in the area just had a weird, fearful cloud over their heads. Everyone was terrified. Department stores sold out of locks, and these were people that before never even locked their doors, and now everyone was buying locks because they were no longer going to sleep feeling safe in their homes. People assumed that whoever killed this family had to have been local because, one, there were no strangers in Holcomb, so they thought, okay, this has to be somebody who knew the family. One, because there were no strangers in the area, and two, because of the sheer brutality of the crime. And right before, literally, I think I'm pretty sure it was the day before they were murdered, Herb had actually taken out a really big life insurance policy on him and I believe his family as well. No, I think it was just him. Either way, he had just taken out a huge life insurance policy. And it's actually really sad because I haven't actually mentioned this yet, but Bonnie and Herb actually had two older daughters that were already moved out of the house. So when the murder happened, initially, these two girls were considered suspects and they were looked into. Obviously, they were quickly ruled out, but because of the life insurance policy, they were looked into as suspects in their own family's murder. So sad. Another person who was initially considered a suspect, so sad, was Nancy's boyfriend, Bobby, who was also a pallbearer at the funeral. Apparently, like, Herb wasn't like a big fan of Bobby, or at least he wasn't like a big fan of his teenage daughter spending so much time with Bobby, and I mean, that's a tale as old as time right there. Additionally, Nancy was the only one in the family who was shot in the back of the head. The rest of the family members were shot while they were looking at their murderer, so it was thought that Nancy's might have been a bit more personal and that the person who killed her couldn't look her in the face when doing it. And on top of all of that, he was one of the last people to ever see the Clutter family alive, so they ended up suspecting him. They even gave him a polygraph test, which he passed, and he was quickly ruled out, but because he had even been questioned in the first place, he was continuously ridiculed at school to the point that he ended up switching schools just to get away from the harassment. The police did have some evidence to go on because these two men were bumbling idiots and weren't very good at not leaving evidence behind at their crime scene. There was a bloody footprint on the ground at the crime scene from when one of the two men, I believe it was Perry, had stepped in Herb's blood after killing him and left a footprint on the ground. And this footprint proved to be very helpful because it helped them identify the type of boot that the killer was wearing. Additionally, they later found that there was another footprint at the property, which let them know that there were two killers and not one. Because initially they thought it was just one murderer, but once they realized that there were two different boot prints, they were like, shit, we have two killers on our hands here. People ended up calling in over 250 tips on people who may have had a reason to dislike one member of the Clutter family, but in searching all of these tips, none of them panned out. Until there was one. The police ended up receiving a very, very reliable tip on who may have killed the Clutter family 10 days after the murder. This was after a local newspaper had offered a $1,000 reward for any information on the killers. The man who called in the tip was a man who at the time was incarcerated in Lansing prison, and it was a 32-year-old man named Floyd Wells. You remember Floyd Wells. Floyd told police everything. He told police everything he had told Dick, and he told the police everything Dick had said to him about his plans and what he planned to do with the Clutter family and who he planned to do it with. With this tip, police now had two suspects that they were very, very interested in having a pretty serious conversation with: Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. Speaking of those two, while all of this was happening, they were very busy. So first, right after the murders, as they were driving back towards home, they stopped in I think they went down a dirt road that was like a dead end, I'm pretty sure. They pulled over and they buried a bunch of items in the earth. Some shells, casings, cord, tape, all the items used to bound the Clutter family, and also the gloves that they had been wearing. They buried them in the earth. They then hit the road and headed back towards Dick's family's house, kind of talking about what they were going to do at this point, because initially they had planned to take all this money, they were going to go to Mexico, they were going to buy a boat, and they were going to live happily ever after, free from persecution for their crimes. But they had no money, because the Clutters had no money in their home. Jesus. So the two finally ended up back in Dick's hometown. Perry went to a hotel and Dick went back home to his family, and they planned to leave the following weekend and they were going to go off to Mexico, but first they needed to make some money. So over the next week, Dick went back to his old tricks of writing bad checks at different stores, getting cash back, getting the items, like he'd buy big ticket items like TVs and stuff, and then he'd get cash back, so he would then have the items to sell and cash, and he knew that by the time he had left and by the time they had realized that the checks were bad, him and Perry were going to be long gone in Mexico. And Dick had this thing about him where he was very charming, he was very charismatic, and people just trusted him. They believed that he was like a good guy, which is very, very crazy. He was a very talented con man, and he just had that sort of vibe to him, like a trustworthy vibe, which is scary, honestly. So as planned, the following weekend, the two left to Mexico, but they didn't stay there very long because they ran through their money incredibly quickly while they were there, and they were like, oh shit, we have no money. What are we gonna do? Did they get a job? No, they took the last of their money, they bought a couple of guns, and they headed back to the States. Once back in the States, the men ditched their car and they started hitchhiking all across the country. They went everywhere, man. They were just moving, and they wanted to make sure that their load wasn't so heavy, so all the items they had with them, they shipped to Las Vegas so that they could pick it up later, because that's where they planned on ending up eventually. What they wanted to do was move across the land until they had pulled off a big enough job to get enough money to go to Brazil, so that if they were ever found out, if they ever got caught, if the police figured out it was them who killed the Clutters, they could not be extradited back to the US. The two ended up back in Kansas again, which to me sounds like the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I don't know why you would go back to a state where you just passed a bunch of bad checks, just killed some people, then went to Mexico. Either way though, they went back and he was able to cash more bad checks. They ended up getting about $500 for him. The two then ended up all the way in Florida, and this is where they spent Christmas together, and then they went through several states on their way back to Las Vegas, where they finally ended up to pick up their items. Things finally came to a head 46 days after the murder, 5 days after Christmas on December 30th, 1959. And something about that date is just very poetic to me. It's like the universe would not let the new year roll in with these two assholes still on the loose. So what happened is that authorities in Las Vegas had received information from authorities in Kansas, kind of like a bolo. They received the description of the car the men might be driving and a description of the two men. Because at this point, these two are people of interest. Because, okay, first, they're told by this man that they're probably guilty. And the cops go to investigate and they're like, huh, these guys just disappeared right after the murders. Wait a minute. So one day, there's a couple officers that are driving around Las Vegas when they notice a car that matched the make and model of the car that Perry and Dick were known to be driving at the time. Because apparently they got a new car. It's so weird. This is weird. How did they know what car they were in? I missed something there. I realize I missed something there. I'm sorry about that. Either way, at some point, they know what type of car these men are driving. Cops are going by, they see the car, and it's parked outside of a post office. And that is because Dick and Perry were at this post office in Las Vegas picking up the items that they had shipped to themselves there. So, naturally, they are arrested and the box containing the items was taken in as evidence. And man, once police searched this box, these men's fates were sealed because inside the box there were 2 pairs of boots. The same boots that had left the boot prints at the Clutter family crime scene. So they questioned the 2 men separately, and initially Dick went into this interrogation thinking he was just getting questioned for these bad checks that he had been slinging all over town. So they're questioning him, it's kind of casual, and finally the officer kind of changes gears and he's like, okay, so forget the checks. Why were your footprints left at the scene of a quadruple homicide? And Dick was like, oh shit. And initially he tried to protest it, but eventually he did just cave in. Apparently after Dick made his confession, he fell into the arms of the officers because the drama. And initially Perry stood strong. He was like, I'm not admitting anything. Me and Dick said if we were ever caught, we weren't going to say anything. But then he learned that Dick was talking and he learned what Dick was saying, and Perry got pissed. So on the drive back from Las Vegas to Kansas, he told his whole side of the story. Perry's story pretty much matched Dick's almost perfectly. It definitely corroborated it and made it seem like they had the same experience. They probably weren't lying. The only differences were that, one, Dick had also stabbed Herb Clutter in the throat. Like after Perry had slit his throat, he stabbed him in the same wound. That he wanted to rape Nancy, which he left that little bit of information out initially. And that Dick was the one who had actually killed both Nancy and Bonnie. Later, Perry did try to retract this, saying that he was the one who killed all 4, and he didn't want to put, Dick's family through the trauma of thinking their son was a murderer when he wasn't, but who knows? Side note, Dick's father, this poor man, was so, devastated at what his son had done. His health went really, really poor. He got really, really sick, and he ended up dying, shortly after the trial. Once the men arrived back in Kansas, they showed up to a town that was thirsty for blood. Man, these guys, the town wanted them dead. The town wanted them gone. They were so incredibly hated. And some of the people, I'm sure, just wanted to look evil in the eye because these men were evil. Like Perry Smith, there's something wrong with that guy, dude. Because he even said after the fact that he didn't feel bad at all, that he felt nothing at all about what he had done. The trial was pretty similar to their first initial arrival back in Kansas. People were, the place was full. Every seat was full. There were people waiting out in the hallway hoping to get a seat. People were showing up super early. It was very popular. Everyone wanted to see this trial. And during the trial, the men were pretty nonchalant. Perry just sat and stared straight ahead, and Dick mostly chewed gum. It was one point where they were together and they were smiling at each other and talking at each other. And there is a photo of this that people called the last smile. And it's a bit weird to think of somebody smiling in that situation, but either way. This trial was less about proving guilt because it was pretty apparent that they were guilty, but it was more about whether or not they were going to get the death penalty. The defense attorneys for the 2 men did everything they could to ensure they didn't get the death penalty. They They didn't try to say that the men weren't guilty because they clearly were, but they did try to illustrate the fact that both men had mental health issues that were mitigating factors. Perry, being a borderline psychopath who had no feelings, no emotions for anything or anyone, likely due to his upbringing, and Dick, his head injury. The defense even brought a mental health expert to the trial to testify on their behalf, but the judge would not allow this doctor to elaborate on his feelings about these men. I'll explain. Basically, the judge told him he could only answer yes or no to the questions. He couldn't elaborate whatsoever. So he was asked, when it came to Dick, did Richard Hickok know the difference between right and wrong when he committed the act? And the doctor said yes. He wanted to say more and explain more, but wasn't able to. And when he was asked for Perry, he was asked, do you have an opinion on whether or not Perry Smith knew right from wrong when he committed the murders? And he said no to that because he said in his mind later, he said he couldn't determine whether or not Perry knew right from wrong, and he wanted to elaborate further, but he wasn't able to. The defense was basically begging for mercy and begging for life in prison for these men, and the prosecution wanted the death penalty. The prosecution was like, listen, they murdered an entire family for $20 apiece, which is accurate. The jury deliberated for only 30 minutes in this case, which is like unheard of in a murder case in general, especially one this high profile. But they did, and they came back with their verdict, and that was that these men would be put to death by hanging. The fact that we were still hanging people in the 60s is insane to me. I don't know what I thought, but I did not realize that we were still doing that, and that's just absolutely wild to me. That was not that long ago. Anyways, these two men obviously tried to appeal their convictions. Dick was really, really going hard trying to get his appeal, saying that they never got a fair trial because the trial took place in the area where the murders were committed. But their defense attorneys at the time were like, no, we really thought that because this case was so widespread, everyone had heard about it, it was so popular that there was nowhere they could go where people wouldn't have heard about the murders. And that if anything, because Holcomb was such a religious community, they would be less likely to put someone to death. So in the end, these appeals were unsuccessful. They were able to prolong the inevitable for 5 years, and on April 14th, 1965, both men were strapped with their arms down by their sides. Nooses were placed around their necks, and they were asked if they had any last words, and then one by one, they were hung until they were dead, while a crowd of spectators watched. Not just the people who were invited to the execution, but people out on the street who could just get like a little glimpse of the gallows. Everyone wanted to see these people die. Perry Smith was 36 and Richard Hickok was 33. Now, real quick, it is actually suspected that the Clutter family is not the only family that was murdered by Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. In December of 2012, both Perry Smith and Richard Hickok's bodies were exhumed to hopefully abstract DNA because it was suspected that the Clutter family was only one of two families that this duo had annihilated. There was a family, the Walker family, that consisted of Cliff Walker, his wife Christine Walker, and their two children, 3-year-old Jimmy and 2-year-old Debbie. All members of the family were shot and killed in December of 1959. The baby girl was also possibly drowned. Her body was found in a bathtub. And Christine, the mother, was also raped. So there's a couple reasons that people think that Perry and Dick were responsible for these crimes as well. One, the way that they were killed. They were all shot, just like the Clutters, and the fact that the wife, Christine, was raped, knowing that Dick wanted, at least, to rape Nancy. Two, the timing. The Walker family murders happened 34 days after the Clutter family murders. And three, proximity. So the Walker family was murdered in Florida, and we know that during the time that they were murdered, Perry and Dick were in Florida, and they had even bought some items from a store that was just miles from the Walker family home. So they were definitely in the area as well. Unfortunately, the DNA failed to link the duo to this crime. It wasn't to say that they didn't commit the crime, but it had been so long, they had been buried in the ground for so long that their DNA was far too degraded for there to be a match. But to this day, the Walker murders are unsolved, and Perry and Dick are still considered viable suspects. And that, my friends, is the story of the Clutter family murders and the lives and deaths of the two men who murdered them. Isn't that just so crazy? I never understand why people do the things they do, because my brain just works so differently than theirs does, you know? I could just never do what they did. I mean, to be fair, I've never lived the lives that they lived, but I just can't imagine having, it's just crazy how people can feel so differently and have such a different opinion on the world and the people in it. You know what I mean? I just can't imagine that complete lack of empathy for another person. I can't even hurt somebody's feelings without feeling bad for it. I can't imagine murdering somebody, Jesus. And how wild is it to think about Truman Capote in his book? Okay, because first, if you haven't read it, you should absolutely read it. One, because it essentially created the genre that we're also interested in, obviously, if you're watching this video. And two, it's just like really, really well written. I really enjoyed it. It's probably one of my favorite books that I've read in a really long time. And it's probably so good due to, one, the fact that he's just talented, and two, the fact that he actually went to Holcomb. I believe he went there before, he went there before Perry and Dick were even caught, as far as I know. And he just got to know the people. He got to talk to the police. He got to see the scenes. He got to really experience what the town was experiencing at the same time. And then after the two men were caught, Truman spent time talking to them as well. And he actually developed like a friendship with both of the killers. He said that Dick was very personable and easy to talk to, and he connected with him very quickly and very easily. That's the kind of personality that Dick had, but that Perry was a much harder egg to crack. So once he finally did, he felt even closer with Perry. He said, in fact, that he even saw himself in Perry. He said that because they both had shitty childhoods, they were kind of looking at each other as versions of themselves they could have been if they had gone down different paths. Truman even said that he could have seen himself and Perry growing up in the exact same home, and then one day just walking out two separate doors and going down two separate paths. Truman ended up also having a lot of emotional problems from the book, because though he finished his book, he published it, and it made him famous beyond what I doubt he could even imagine it was going to turn into what it did. But at the cost of, you know, it only happened because there was a murder, and it could only end when these men were killed, when they were executed, and at this point these men were his friends. So it was a difficult thing for him to kind of balance in his brain. It's just really wild, man. And with that said, if you want to learn more about this case, the two resources that I would suggest that are very good is first the book In Cold Blood, and there was also a docuseries I watched called Cold Blooded, The Clutter Family Murders, and I was able to access this on Sundance. It was a really good watch if this is a case you're interested in. You got to hear from people who knew the Clutters. You got to hear from surviving family members. And I always find that to be a very valuable thing to watch when you're looking into any case, is to see people who really knew the people who died. It really just helps to see the victims in these cases as people who were loved, people who are missed, and people who were more than their murders. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and it gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, thank you for remembering the Clutter family with me today. It's just so horrible what happened to them, and I can't imagine what they were feeling in that moment. I can't imagine how scared they were. It's just a fucking tragedy, man. And just based on how affected every person was who the Clutters touched in their short lives, they sounded like really great people who were taken from the world, stolen from the world way too soon. Please let me know of any cases you would like to see me cover down below, because as you know, I have a long list of cases, and every time you leave one, I add it to the list with your name so I can give you a shout out, because I know you're filled with good suggestions and good taste, otherwise you would not be here. Of course, if you have not yet, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing the bell, because I put out a new video every single week and I'd love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you. And if you want to follow me on any of my social media, it's all listed down below for you for your convenience, along with like everything that I'm wearing, all the makeup, the earrings, nail polish, just in case you're curious what this badass red lip is, because I know that it is beautiful. And with that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else on the internet. You're tight. This is tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday, and I hope to see you in my next video.